Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chris Johnston, and I'm a board member for the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. Just a reminder, we are a 501c3 nonprofit established in 1997 to support Ohio's only national wildlife refuge complex with youth development, public use projects, and most recently, land acquisition and restoration. We are located along the southern shore of Lake Erie near Oak Harbor in some of the most critical wetland habitats in the world. If you're interested in learning more about us and what we do, I will add a link to the chat in just a moment. This link will point you in the right direction to become a member, make a tax donation, and also we will be able to get the download that our speaker, John Barber, has prepared for us today. John Barber is a citizen scientist with a passion for green space conservation, habitat restoration, and ecological gardening. He has so graciously joined us today to share his program using native plants as a bird feeder, using native plants as bird feeders, a new primer. Before we begin, we ask that you stay muted to minimize the background noise for our presenter. Please type any questions in the Q&A box, and at the end of the program, we will go ahead and answer those questions. We also will have some additional links for you to use, and we also will be recording this program, so you will have access to the recording. So sit back, relax, and have a great time.
Thank you so much, Chris. Again, I'm John Barber. I'd like to say good morning to everyone. I'm co-chair with my partner, Peggy Spaeth, of the Friends of Lower Lake over here in Northeast Ohio, a frequent visitor to Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. And I'm delighted to be talking with you this morning. As volunteers supporting stewardship in local parks and National Wildlife Refuge and so on, we will never run out of work, no doubt about that. I'd like to thank Amy Arendt and Chris Johnston and Tom Romito for arranging this talk. And today I want to share with you how to use native plants as bird and insect feeders. Birds and insects desperately need us to do this in our yards, in our parklands, and in our watersheds. And there are some very straightforward things and simple things that each of us can do. I get a little bit aggressive about some things that I say, don't mean to offend anyone, but we we absolutely cannot simply record on eBird and document with cameras the decline of birds that is happening. We need to be working to reverse that. And we can do that. I'd like to give you some of my ideas about how to do that. And it all starts with one premise. And that premise is that every plant that sits in your yard or in your local parklands is a decision. And you make a decision when you leave that plant there, when you replace that plant, or when you plant a new plant. So let's talk about this a little bit. I hope that everyone has the handout that Chris sent out ahead of time. If not, I think it's going to be posted in the chat. This handout has links and references for other volunteer groups, for some of the books that I refer to, as well as plant lists and where to find plants. And I want to say a special thanks to Chris and to Amy for pointing out some places in Northwest Ohio that cooperate with the Friends of the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge on sharing plant sales. A marvelous idea. So to get right into it, our native birds are in trouble. I'm sure you've all seen this. Billions and billions of birds have disappeared over the last 60 years. And populations of our resident species and most of our migratory species are in trouble. They're declining, and some of them are declining precipitously. So there are things we can do, and there are things that we should do and should do now. To back up just a minute, the seed-eating birds that most of us see around our feeders, for the most part, have stable populations. Our house finches, our cardinals, our goldfinches, nuthatches, most of them have relatively stable populations, according to Cornell. The big hit is to the insect-eating birds, and it is the insect-eating birds that have the most significant population declines. And those are the places that we can have the biggest impact right away in our yards. There's simple actions. There are 4 simple actions that I'm going to repeat over and over again today. The first one is to provide clean and safe water. Very, very straightforward. Clean and safe water year-round for our birds to eat, and also for many of our insects. Provide a wide variety. Number 2, provide a wide variety of shrubs and grasses, sedges, perennials, trees that are native to your area. And you do this in your yard. Number 3, never use insecticides or rodenticides. This is said over and over again, but they are so readily available and oftentimes are snuck into garden sprays. And you may not be aware that a garden spray that is listed for one purpose may in fact have insecticides buried in it. And then finally, never permit cats outdoors. Never. Eliminate strays where you can. You can build catios to give your cat the outdoor experience without letting it outdoors. But I ask you to take each of these 4 simple steps in your own yards, starting as soon as you can. Well, what's missing from this? And what's missing from this are bird feeders. I haven't mentioned bird feeders to help birds. So why is this? Well, there's nothing wrong with bird feeders, but bird feeders are for us. Bird feeding is driven primarily by economics, not by ecology. Seeds feed only a very small subset of the birds in our yards. 95% of nesting birds feed insects to their young. Now, studies in England have shown repeatedly nesting success is equal in areas that bird feeders are out and bird feeders are not out. Winter survival is equal when feeders are present and feeders are not present. So when we say bird feeders help birds, that in many cases is an exaggeration. And on top of that, there's some downsides. Feeders concentrate birds unnaturally, and that can spread disease. I think right now, the reports I'm hearing are of salmonella being spread very rapidly throughout the eruption of pine siskins. Back, for those of you who remember, especially if you're bird banders, you may remember house finches were hit horribly in the 80s and 90s by an eye disease. I think that eye disease continues today. And so feeders do concentrate birds, and they can be disease spreaders if they're not maintained properly. The one I think is most intriguing and might be most important in suburban areas like the Cleveland Heights area that we live in, and that is that feeders help support predators of open cup nests. And by this I mean jays and grackles, cowbirds, red-bellied woodpeckers. And a recent study from 2017 showed that neighborhoods that had high concentrations of bird feeders had much lower nesting success of open cup nesters like robins and cardinals and red-eyed vireos. And so as we help grackles and jays get through the winter, we may be setting the stage up for a less successful nesting season the following year. Also, birdseed and suet and mealworms, particularly freeze-dried mealworms, can carry quite a carbon footprint, and I worry about that. As a bluebird trail monitor, I'm constantly asked, should I be feeding freeze-dried mealworms in my yard to help the bluebirds? And I ask people to look at the bag of their freeze-dried mealworms. Here are 2 examples pulled off of Amazon. An 11-pound bag of freeze-dried mealworms is actually a pretty big bag, but there it is, made in China. And 3 or 4 years ago, freeze-dried mealworms had Trump tariffs put on them in addition, which I find kind of ironic. And so the carbon footprint to bring in high-protein dried mealworms from China has got to be very big. And in our efforts to help birds, are we really contributing to the increase in carbon in our environment. So I love bird feeders. I'm a bird bander, very happily a bird bander, and I do band around feeders in my yard. So I know they're for me, I enjoy them, but I wanted to put a couple of best practices down here before we get into the plants. Bird feeders are for us, let's remember that. They should be supplemental to native plants. You should always use high quality bird seed like thistle and black oil sunflower, and not the cheap millet mixes that most of which end up on the ground. It's very important to monitor what's feeding on and under your feeder. If all you have are starlings and house sparrows, you're probably doing more harm than good with your bird feeders. And then finally, be sure to clean your feeders regularly. I even recommend in warm weather once a month to empty your bird feeders, put fresh seed in, and wash the feeders with a very, very weak bleach or vinegar solution. And be sure to clean under your feeders regularly. Rake up the seed hulls. I don't compost those. I simply throw them out. But be sure to clean both the feeders and under the feeders. So let's get into the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is when we aren't feeding them seeds, birds eat insects, they eat fruit, and they eat seeds. And we can and should create a bird buffet by planting native plants. Now, I think for many of you, this may be a very familiar encouragement. It does come from Doug Tallamy. Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, a later book, Nature's Best Home, and his most recent book on oaks is very, very encouraging of native plants to help our insect population. And I'm taking it farther today to say without that insect population, our bird population doesn't stand a chance. So why go native? Native plants support the insects and provide seeds and fruits that birds eat. Native birds and insects co-evolved with native plants in any given eco-region. I don't get tangled up into pre-European versus post-European. It simply did particular plants and insects co-evolve and birds co-evolve together. Plants put up defenses. Some insects learned how to get around those defenses over thousands of years. And we have a nice mutual situation, mutually beneficial situation. Most of our migratory birds eat insects, high protein fuel for their migration. Coming through Ohio, they need to refuel eating insects. Most of them will not eat seeds to refuel. They need to eat insects. And almost all, with some very notable exceptions, of our nesting birds here in northern Ohio feed their young insects, not seeds. And so all of this says, please get more insects. And before I get into this balance slide, which I find very, very illustrative, I do want to say that we have an insect apocalypse. We know that. We read about it. But I think, at least for me, the evidence is absolutely so compelling between Cleveland and Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. When I make that drive 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I would stop for gas because whatever I was driving probably didn't get very good gas mileage. And I would have to clean the bugs off the windshield. And I'm sure all of you remember this as well. Bugs on the windshield was a big deal. But nowadays, when I drive over to Ottawa or drive back on a warm spring or hot summer day, there are very, very few insects that hit the windshield. And a group in Germany did a quantitative study of this and found that the impression that I have is truly what's going on, that there are far fewer insects, and that the windshield sampling technique is one indicator of that. You've probably seen this too. So for so many years, we've looked at plants on the left side of this screen. They have, on this slide, they have decorative value, they're good for screens, They serve as focal points. They might anchor the front of your house or something like that. But today, as we understand a lot more about biodiversity and ecological systems, we understand that the factors on the right are so very, very critical roles for our plants: the food web, the watershed value, soil restoration, pollinator habitat, the most sexy thing going on today, pollinator habitat, and carbon sequestration. And so for so many years, this balance was tipped to the plant. The only important part about a plant is its decorative value. But now we understand so much more about why do we put plants in our yards and public spaces. So what does it mean for birds? Well, habitats with greater than 70% native plants by biomass have the highest nesting success. A really delightful little study of nesting chickadees over in Washington, D.C. showed this. Native plant fruits are more nutritious than non-native. Native plants, once established, need less maintenance and water than some of our delicate nursery plants. And even with blooming time shifts due to climate change, we think native plants may be our best bets. We don't know. We don't know if we should be instead planting deeply southern plants in anticipation of climate change. So here's a fun study. I think some of you may have seen this study. As a bird bander, it's delightful to me. Manomet Bird Observatory over in Massachusetts had a study where they literally analyzed bird poop. Okay. And maybe some of your bird banders who work at McGee and Ottawa and hopefully soon at Howard Marsh will have t-shirts that at the end of the day, particularly when the thrushes are moving through, we'll have t-shirts that are completely spotted with bird poop. So these researchers said, you know, it's interesting. We have some great samples of what migratory birds, primarily catbirds and thrushes, are eating on our t-shirts. And we can take those samples delicately off the t-shirts. And yes, these were probably graduate students who had to do this. But you can take those off, and they, I think, sampled around 860 bird poop samples. They found seeds in close to 500 of those samples, and they sorted and washed those seeds, so took them off their t-shirts and sorted them, and then began identifying what plants the birds were eating by what plants they pooped the seed out from. And so here you can see things like cherries and black gum and blueberries and barberry, berberis is barberry, and viburnum seeds. So this is the key that they use to identify those seeds. Doesn't this sound like fun to identify these seeds and then quantify what these birds are eating? And they found in a sample size of about, I think, a little less than 500 catbirds and thrushes, they found that native plants were definitely preferred even as the birds migrated through areas that had high concentrations of Asian bittersweet, privet, Japanese barberry, and multiflora rose. So we know that migrating birds, if you plant native plants, migrating birds will prefer them, at least in catbirds and thrushes. I just think this is a dandy little study, very illustrative. What's the problem with non-native plants? Well, there's so many problems with non-native plants. Most do not support our native insects, and they were sold for that reason. They were sold because the nursery trade promised us that they could sell us things that would have absolutely no insects eating them. The problem with that is that there were no insects eating them, meaning that they were not host plants for insects. And so in this slide, in the top, you see, one of the most hideous invasives, English ivy, has a tendency to take over, at least here in Cleveland, take over yards, grow up trees, drag down the trees. It has now been determined that it's a host for the horrific oak wilt. It doesn't kill English ivy, but oak wilt will survive there until it can find an oak tree. So there's just nothing good about this, and you see that nothing's eating this. Down below is our native ginger. not the imported shiny leaf ginger, but our native ginger, wild ginger. And you can see that insects have eaten it. They haven't killed it, but they're eating it and they're hosting on it, which means that birds like towhees can go among the wild ginger and find insects to feed their young. Many non-native species become monocultures. If you've seen the patches of privet in Japanese honeysuckle and Japanese knotweed that just take over yards and parks, and they outcompete native plants. We have particularly the vicious Japanese knotweed just forms an incredible monoculture here in Northeast Ohio. And all of this goes in part back to the fact that nurseries act on, at least the nurseries that I grew up with, act on an economic model, not an ecological model. The old model, buy on Memorial Day, mulch and spray and fertilize all summer, discard on Labor Day, repeat next year and the next year and the next year. And if you do that with your impatience and things like that, you miss spring migration entirely. And then the plants are there until Labor Day, you dig them up, you throw them out, and you miss fall migration. And so this old model of Memorial Day to Labor Day completely misses the migratory birds that come through Northeast Ohio. This next slide is just pounding on the idea that for nesting species of birds, we have to provide caterpillars for the most nesting success in 16 out of 20 common bird families here. So if you ignore shrikes as common nesting birds, at least here in Northeast Ohio, most of these birds nest here. And in this almost incomprehensible bar chart, you recognize families of birds that nest around us. And across the bottom, probably too small for most of us to read, are the key to the bars. Left to right, dragonflies, grasshoppers, mantis, cockroaches, true bugs, beetles, caterpillars are green, flies, and spiders. So for so many of these families, you see that caterpillars as a food are the dominant food brought to nestlings. If you've heard Talamy talk about this, he talks about caterpillars as soft and squishy and high protein that can be jammed down a bird's throat without damaging the bird's throat. And so, so many pairs of birds prefer to feed caterpillars to their young. How do we, in our yards, in our parklands, how do we provide caterpillars? So Desiree Narango, 2019, a very important study, one that I just can't imagine the work that went into it. So let's talk about native plants on top: goldenrod, clover, asters, native strawberry, sunflowers. Desiree Narango and her team found hundreds of species of caterpillars, 132 on goldenrods, 132 different species of caterpillars on goldenrods. And then compare the common nursery plants down below, where daffodils hosted one species of caterpillar, zinnias hosted 9, hyacinths didn't host any caterpillars at all in this study. And so you say, as biodiversity people, as bird people, as insect people, what do we plant? We plant things from the top list, not from the bottom list. And it's okay to have some of your favorites. I have some of my favorites that may not be natives, but over 70%, our goal should be over 70% of the plants in our yards should be from the kinds of things that are listed on the top of this slide. And shrubs are critical. And I know that as Ottawa continues to expand the land it has, shrubs are a critical part of the planting, and I'm so appreciative of the work that's being done to plant shrubs. But look at the difference here, and this is important in our suburban neighborhood, and I encourage you to look in your own yards after we finish this talk. Native shrubs like dogwoods, 118 caterpillar species, witch hazel, the native witch hazel, virginiana, 63, viburnums, 104 species of caterpillars. And then down at the bottom part of this slide, privets, which dominate Cleveland Heights, and barberry, still sold, unfortunately, in so many nurseries. Buckthorns, glossy and common buckthorn. Forsythia, one species, no nectar, no pollen, and it hosts one species of caterpillar. It might as well be plastic. And so I ask you to look at your yards and look at your parklands and pull out non-native and invasive shrubs and flowers and replace them with native shrubs and flowers. Birds are an indicator, for us anyway. We continue to see here in Cleveland Heights an ever increasing number of species of birds coming through our yard, as our yard is now close to 100% native. But there's another factor here also, and that factor is that historically, our yards have fed our watersheds and our parklands and our national wildlife refuges. And so seeds of these non-native plants that we planted in our yards, or previous owners of our house planted in our yards, got spread by birds, got spread by water, got spread by wind, and have now started to take over our parklands and in some cases the edges of our national wildlife refuges. So what are we going to feed the areas around us? My argument is please feed into the seed bank native plants, not invasive plants, not non-native plants. On the left is one of our most enthusiastic volunteers standing in front of a 60-foot long mountain of privet and buckthorn that she removed. I think there's a Norway maple almost at her feet. But she removed that over the course of last summer and replaced it with spicebush and viburnum and elderberry and a wide variety of dogwoods. And on the right are some of our volunteers enthusiastically planting something that I don't recognize at this distance. So why do we change our yards? We change our yards because if they're dominated by non-native plants, in one study of Carolina chickadees, 75% fewer caterpillars were there if the yard had greater than 75% biomass non-native. 60% of those yards were less likely to have nesting chickadees, fewer eggs, less clutch survival. Nests produced fewer fledglings. And so, again and again now, studies are unpacking how sinister the impact of non-native plants are. So when I talk to you, I say, please, in your yards, this is, Talamy and his group call it the Homegrown National Park. And of course, to this group, I'm going to say the Homegrown National Wildlife Refuge. This is where we turn our yards into extensions of our parks and our national wildlife refuges. We put in trees for canopy, the monsters. We put in lots of understory trees. We put in shrubs everywhere. We have perennials massed in clumps. We leave the leaf litter. As I think you've probably read, the best place to leave leaf litter is under the tree that produced it. You put logs in your yard. You put patches of bare earth in your yard for the ground nesting bees. You grow thickets to help our cup nesting birds survive. So if you do this, and do it over years, the handout that comes along with this talk has a variety of plant lists. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to produce food for birds for all 4 seasons. Bugs, and shelter in the spring, bugs, nest sites, and nest material in the summer, bugs, fruit, nutritious berries, and shelter in the autumn, and seeds and berries and shelter in the winter. There's a wonderful book, Sharon Sorensen, Planting Native to Attract Your Birds to Your Yard. I'm sure that by the time we finish this talk, Amy will have it available on the bookshelves at the refuge store when the refuge store is open. This is a wonderful book for Midwest yards. Sharon Sorensen, and it is listed on the handout in the event that you choose to find a copy of it. Talamy talks a lot about keystone species, and those keystone species are species where the genus or genera have a tendency to produce the most caterpillars. And so it isn't evenly distributed across the plant kingdom, but the really heavy hitters, the ones you want to plant first: oaks, cherries and plums, willows, birches, poplars, goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers. These are called keystone species because they produce an outsized number of caterpillars that will help nesting birds and help, of course, as host plants for those insects. This well over 250-year-old white oak is such a classic example. The white oaks that I planted that are now 36 inches tall in my yard won't reach this size in my lifetime, but I like to think that somebody else will appreciate them. So this is different. This is different. It doesn't talk about how critical it is to put up bird feeders for your birds, because that's not critical. It's very important for us. It has great educational and, for me, great joy quotients, but it doesn't affect the survival of birds. What affects survival and reproductive success of birds is habitat, including your yard. So use habitat as a bird feeder by planting a wide variety of native plants, and do it now. I do want to put a caution up there. Older books, and actually some recent books, still do have what to plant for birds. And that focuses an awful lot on berries, which don't really help nesting birds. And so please go to the National Wildlife Federation site, go to the Audubon Society, National Audubon Society site, and there they will have native plant lists where you can type in your zip code and get a list of the native plants that will do well in your area and help birds. Some of the old what to plant lists include plants that have now been identified as invasive. And unfortunately, I can take personal credit for a large swath of pyracanthus in Baltimore, where I used to live, and planted pyracanthus in a median strip expressly for the purpose of increasing the populations of cedar waxwings. I was very successful in increasing the population of pyracantha. Maryland has now banned that plant. Leave the leaves, leave the logs. We take pieces of firewood and drill holes in the end of them for the bees to nest in. We leave those logs in the leaf litter. When it comes time to cut down the flower stalks, we simply cut them down and leave them in the garden beds. We don't clean them up. We just leave them in place. Over 90% of the caterpillars that live in Northeast Ohio overwinter in leaves and soil. And so a gas-powered leaf blower blowing air at 95 miles an hour doesn't do anything for those overwintering insects except kill them. And the way I put it is that there is a high ecological value in a little bit of messiness. One of the things I also want to mention is that there are a lot of plant lists that are recommended to us that talk about very, very specific plants that we'll get if we plant this species of plant. And I find that to be a little bit discouraging. I don't think it's necessary to make up a list of all the birds you want to see in your yard and then try to figure out the specific plants that those birds love most. My encouragement, my recommendation, my admonition is to plant the widest variety of native plants that you can fit into your yard. And we even have pots of native plants on our driveway and pots of native plants on our front porch because we don't have room to plant all the things we want to plant. It is true If you want goldfinches, you plant sunflowers. If you want catbirds, plant elderberries. If you want Cape May warblers, plant currants. If you want winter red poles, plant birches. If you want cedar waxwings, plant winterberries, not pyracanthus. If you want starlings, plant mealworms. If you want Cooper's hawks, put up seed feeders. So you can be very, very specific in the kinds of things that you try to do. But my encouragement to all of you is to please plant variety and let the birds find you. So in conclusion, as we wrap things up here, make bird feeders your last action, not your first. Please use no insecticides or rodenticides. We have a big issue here in Cleveland Heights with rat poison and homeowners using rat poison, even though we have barred owls here and in good numbers and coyotes. Keep all cats indoors, please. Keep all cats indoors, provide clean and safe water, plant a wide variety of native plants, and ensure that you, in your yards, have a diverse habitat. And then look carefully and enjoy the birds in your yard. Great, John. How do I start? Well, start small. All right. You can't do your whole yard this afternoon. It might be tempting. The weather's beautiful. But start small. But most importantly, start now. Plant some keystone species of trees or shrubs in your yard. You can plant small ones. They'll grow up. Remove an invasive shrub. Go after that barberry. Please go after that privet. Go after the burning bush and replace it with a dogwood, elderberry, ninebark, buttonbush, and see the handout. Repeat this often. I always have to remind people, it's great to take invasive shrubs out of parklands, but do get permission first. And the same is true for your neighbors' yards. If you get very enthusiastic from this presentation and you want to take some barberry out of your neighbor's yard, it's a good idea to get permission first. Please continually transform your yard into a mostly native plant yard. It's a transformation process. It can take a number of years to do that. You can do that. Volunteer with a group. I'm talking to a group of volunteers for the Friends of the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. This is such a fantastic way to exchange native plant seeds, to exchange pieces of native plants, cuttings from native plants, and exchange information. The Friends of the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge are a resource as well as an opportunity for volunteer group. And if you can't volunteer, donate. Donate. If you can't donate your time, donate your treasure in places where you bird, because we need you to do that. My partner Peggy and I have put together a fairly rich palette of resources, of books, of plant lists, of places you can volunteer. And as I'm sure Amy has for Northwest Ohio. And so please visit ecologicalheights.com, spend some time there. It's a fun website. Spend some time there and look at the resources. My email address is there, or you can find me through Amy. And I'm happy to add additional resources to that site if you find those to be particularly valuable. So at this time, I'm going to stop talking and open it up to questions. Amy and Chris, if we have questions in the chat box or just questions that people want to ask, I'll do my best. And thank you for your time this morning.
Great. Thank you so much, John. We do have a couple questions in the chat box if you'd like to go ahead and start with those. And then I'll go ahead and unmute people. So the first question that we have is there a problem with feeding safflower seed?
No, there isn't. Cardinals in particular love it. Just keep your feeders clean and keep underneath clean.
Great, thank you. And then that brings us to our second question, which is, are black walnuts native?
Yes, I believe they are.
Great, okay. I am Okay. Are all sunflowers desirable or are there native species? It looks like we're using the chat for questions, which is great. If you want to unmute yourself, please just let me know and I'll gladly unmute you.
There are native sunflowers, and I would encourage you to look at some of the plant lists. I'm not sure we have that on the handout, but it's certainly on the ecological heights. Yes, there are. And what we find is that the native sunflowers, and they keep moving around which genus they put them in, the native sunflowers do very quickly have caterpillars feeding on their leaves. And some of the mixes of giant sunflowers, 6 feet tall sunflowers and that sort of thing that the goldfinches love to eat the seeds on, very rarely do I find any insects eating the leaves. So again and again through this talk, I've said one of the measures that we can use is anything eating the leaves of the plant? And if not, then you're not feeding the insects. So you might have pollinators and you might have birds feeding on the seeds, but one of the measures of success is something eating the leaves, because then the plant is a host for the native insects that we want to help.
Okay, we have another question. And someone asked me to drop the handout back into the chat box, and I went ahead and did that. Are black oil sunflower bird feeding seeds helpful to grow into plants?
They're very good for goldfinches. Goldfinches love to feed on the seeds of them. And in a number of cases, I don't seem to have any choice because the nuthatches in my yard and the titmice will cache those seeds, C-A-C-H-E, will cache those seeds in odd places. And so I will have a growth of black oil sunflower seed plants coming up in the oddest places. And I realize that's because nuthatches and titmice have cached those seeds and then forgotten to come back for them later. Yes, you can grow up your black oil sunflower seeds, but I would look for the perennial native sunflowers. Amy and Chris, if you can please mention the Bunch Nursery is going to have a plant sale coming up May 1st. And if that be the case, if I have that date correctly, I would go to that plant sale and ask them for perennial native sunflowers, where you can simply have them come up year after year without asking the titmice and nuthatches to forget where they cached their seeds.
Great, thank you. I do have another question. Let's see, I'm going to scroll through and make sure I get them all, okay? Is there some sort of guide as to where to plant the 5-layer habitat in our yards, especially for those who live in urban locations that have limited yard space?
Most of the folks here in Cleveland Heights that are now part of a big pollinator effort that we're working on literally started in the back of their yards and worked forward toward their houses. Because in a lot of cases, they already had tall trees. They might be non-native Norway maples or silver maples, but they planted native trees that at some point, as the silver maples and Norway maples age out, they planted trees to do that. But look at the sun, look at where your hose can reach, because for the first year or so, you'll want to be able to water them easily, just the first year or two. And then also places where you can perhaps cage some of the younger things against deer. On our street in downtown Cleveland Heights, we often have 7 to 8 deer at a time walking up and down the street looking for food. And so certainly for a number of our species, we do need to cage plants for the first couple years until they get established.
Great, thank you so much. Also, a couple of reminders. Amy went ahead and dropped some of the native sunflowers into the chat for those of you who missed that. There was also another upcoming plant sale that was dropped in the chat for the wild one's oak openings chapter, and they stated, Kim said that they would have some of the native sunflowers at that plant sale. I'm checking to see if there's any additional questions at this time.
And Chris, may I interrupt for a moment?
Sure.
If depending on which native sunflower it is, there is one native sunflower that is particularly successful, and you can find that it has a tendency to perhaps spread very quickly in your garden. We have it planted in a place next to a walk, and we almost every year dig up about a third of it, put it in pots, and give it to other people because it transplants so readily. And we've also done some guerrilla gardening, although I didn't say that on a recorded line. We've done some guerrilla gardening where we've put this native sunflower into places where people have said nothing will grow, and in public parklands, and found that it's done fantastically.
Great. Thank you so much. Are there any additional questions at this time? Okay. Just to kind of wrap up, I wanted to remind everybody, first off, I want to thank you, John, for such a great presentation. It was really, a lot of great comments in the chat box. I hope you take a moment to look them over. Also, I wanted to remind everyone that this is just number one of a virtual series that we'll be doing. So if you really enjoyed this program, and again, we thank you for joining us, you can find the full program calendar at www.friendsofottawanwr.org/Seek Refuge Days. I'm going to go ahead and drop that link in the chat right now. And you should all be able to see that. And then as a special thank you for those of you that have joined us and taken the time to complete a survey, because of course your feedback is valuable to us. We have access to a special coupon code for the Rookery Nature Store online. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that link next into the chat. And again, just a reminder that today's presentation is being recorded, so you will have access to that. And I'm dropping the final chat, or the final link in the chat right now. So I think at this time that concludes our program. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and John, for doing what you do.
You're welcome. Thank you all.